Hello and welcome to In Sync, a different way of operating in life that aims to bring us more in alignment or more in sync with who we really are, but also in greater alignment with a different way of operating in our world that I believe is a better fit for the world that we live in today in this 21st century, because I think that many of us are operating from an outdated model of reality or an outdated way of living in our world that is beginning to fall apart. It's not working for a lot of us, and we're in fact seeing a lot of the signs of things out there beginning to not work as well as they once did. And I wanted to create this podcast to give us and to give those of us who are sensing that there is a real need for something different, somewhere that they could come and learn and find out and explore what it means to really live in deeper alignment and in greater sync with who we are, our true nature, but also what I believe to be a more accurate understanding of how the world really works and how the universe really operates. And I think that getting into a deeper and greater alignment within ourselves also brings us into a far better alignment with the universe and how things work. And when the two things are aligned and working well, I think we will find that our lives begin to improve. Things tend to get better, and all the things that we're searching for and looking for tend to fall into place with a lot more flow and not having to force it so much the way we're often taught that we need to, or often feel as though we need to. From my experience, I've certainly felt like and have met a lot of people that just feel like it's a real grind and a real struggle, the way many of us are taught to operate. So I wanted to create this podcast so that we could begin putting this out there and giving people somewhere they could go to find that. So I've just found, as I mentioned, that what we've been taught is beginning to break down, and it's not that we are the problem per se, because I believe that we're born whole. I believe that we are all born with everything that we need in order to succeed, in much the same way, if you can think of it as like a bit of an acorn or a seed, where within that acorn there is an inner blueprint, if you will, or an inner architecture that will have everything that it needs to know. All the intelligence is within that can then grow over time, so that we can all grow into this grand oak tree. Everything is contained within that acorn, and I think we're born in much the same way, where everything is within us that we need to be effective and successful and fulfilled in our lives. But I think we've gotten a little bit further away from that because of the outdated model that I believe that a lot of us have been taught is the way to be successful or effective in our lives. So when you actually look and consider how things operate when we come into this life, we come in as essentially a blank slate, right? Or a blank canvas as babies when we're brought into this world. And we're then essentially programmed by our parents, by our upbringing, by our society, by our education systems, our friends and other relationships, and the world as we see it. And we don't have much awareness when we first come into this world around our choices. And we are therefore receiving all of this programming around how we're meant to be and how we need to be structured and how we need to operate. And it's often someone else's choice or the choices of a larger collective, and we are therefore essentially unaware of how we're being programmed, and we may be receiving programming that ultimately shapes who we are and shapes our identities, and it may not be aligned with who we really are. And it may take some years after growing up and being programmed to be someone that isn't necessarily aligned with our true selves and our true nature, and therefore life can feel like a bit of a struggle. So we can often get misaligned when the way we've been programmed isn't really aligned with who we really are deep down, right? So when those two things don't align, then we can often feel like life has a lot of friction, right? Perhaps things aren't working, but we keep operating according to how we've been taught to live, because that's what we know. And we don't often stop for long enough to really take a step back and ask ourselves some deeper questions, such as, well, is this who I really am? Is this how I really want to live? Is this what I really want to do with my life? Is this who I want to become? Right? So that can easily happen, and I think that's happening for more and more of us. We're coming back into some kind of resonance. We're starting to ask deeper questions that are starting to bring us back into deeper resonance with who we really are. And a lot of the models of operating that many of us have been taught are models that have gotten us to build our self-worth around this performance culture, whereby in order for us to be worthy and be valued by our society, we need to perform. We need to achieve certain results, right? You go through school, you've got to expect to achieve certain grades in order to progress to the next level, right? And then to go on to higher levels of education and eventually be worthy of getting a job or being ready to start our own business if you're more entrepreneurial. But we often have tied our self-worth and our results to this performance culture. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's important. We all need to make progress in life. But what it's often missing, what I found is often missing, and even if you look at a lot of personal development, and I've spent over 30 years in personal development learning from some of the very best people on the planet, a lot of personal development is still aligned with this performance only culture, right? Where it focuses on fixing our mindset or controlling our mindset or moving us to improve our level of motivation so that we can achieve better results and perform better. And there's a place for that, and it absolutely works if that's where you're at in your life. But I spent many years doing that, and what I found is that after a while, it starts to lack meaning. So when we have this performance-only culture and we focus our lives focusing more and more on performance only, then our lives tend to lack meaning if what we're doing out there isn't aligned with who we really are and who we really want to become. And it's this counterbalance that I believe is the counterbalance of meaning, where if you can appreciate that life is made up of dualities, right? So there's night and day, good and bad, masculine versus feminine, and when you look at performance, then it would be easy to think that the flip side of performance is non-performance. But what I've come to discover is that the natural counterbalance for performance is meaning. And it's when our lives feel like we're only performing without this deeper sense of meaning that we can begin to detach from who we really are, and we can begin to lose our self-worth, and our self-worth can then feel like it's only tied to performance, right? As long as I'm performing, as long as I'm making that much money, as long as I'm living in that house and achieve that kind of status, and can therefore look like this in my physical body and lose X amount of pounds or have X amount of muscle, for example, and as long as I'm hitting all these metrics, right, then I'm accepted by society. I'm worthy, right? And that tends to be how our societies are set up. But when we're living from that place, it can often lack something. And I think that a a lot of us are reaching that point where we're asking deeper questions, where that sense of self-worth being measured by these metrics, by these performance-only metrics, is starting to really lose its grip on how we want to operate and how we want to live. So InSync really aims to drive a greater balance between those two, because it's not that we want to eliminate performance and just live lives of meaning, because that doesn't work either, right? It's about recognizing that performance without a life of performance only without meaning feels empty. But then a life of meaning without performance begins to stagnate, and we don't make progress in life. So it's about driving that balance between performance and meaning. And I think that's not something that we're taught at school, but I think it's something that we're more and more ready for now in the times that we're living in, especially when we're seeing such great technological advances with AI and other exponential technologies that I'm sure we're all starting to learn more and more about. And as these technologies start to assist us with performance and activities that can be automatable, I think it gives us a great opportunity to now have more time to ourselves, where we can start to ask deeper questions about who do we want to become as human beings when the world is becoming more and more technologically advanced, right? I think we have a great opportunity now with all this change that's going on out there in the world to ask some of these deeper questions and really get conscious about how we want to evolve and how we want to be in this new world that's emerging and taking place right before our very eyes. So that's part of the invitation that I have for you as you're listening to this and as you're considering some of these deeper questions, is who do we want to become, right? When this world is going through great technological change. And what you'll find as we explore some of these conversations is that you'll find that some of the concepts that I'll discuss in some of the very next episodes will give us opportunities to ask some of those deeper questions and to address some of those challenges that we're seeing out there, and to go further and figure out how do we want to consciously evolve with the changes that are coming into our lives. So the whole InSync idea comes from this other way of operating. So what I ended up discovering as I've been through my own journey over the last 30 or so years, discovering various different philosophies and learnings, largely in the personal development world, learning from some of the best teachers in personal and spiritual development, but also through my life experience, working with technology on a large scale, working with multinational organizations, is that I discovered that there's really this way of operating that I believe is one that we want to work towards. So I came up with this concept of the InSync OS, which is a new operating system, or a different operating system, that I'll discuss in further depth in the next few episodes, whereby we'll talk about the three components of the OS. And these components work together, especially the first two, which then sort of lead to the third one. But I'll talk about each one in depth in the next few episodes. So my hope is that you'll watch at least the first 4 episodes and get a clear and good grounding into the operating system, which provides some clear and I believe simple frameworks for operating in this new world that's emerging right before us. So the 3 components of the InSync OS are, number 1, our inner architecture. So this looks at how we're made up from the inside, right? And there are 3 layers to our inner architecture. And you could certainly have an argument for going into more and more detail, but I think you'll find that these sort of three layers make a lot of sense. And again, we'll go into that in the next episode, but of where I talk about inner architecture. But that component is all about understanding how we're made up, and have we actually been developed? When, I talked about our programming earlier, has our programming been one that's evolved in alignment with who we really are, or is it one that is out of alignment and therefore it's leading to some of the issues that we might be experiencing, the friction, the challenges that we may be experiencing, and life's full of challenges, and we'll never get rid of those. But it's about, am I experiencing some of these challenges in my life because there is an incongruency between how my inner architecture has been programmed and how I'm actually wired, that's more aligned with who I really am. So our inner architecture will look at these three layers, where we'll look at our psychology as the first layer. We'll look at the emotional and somatic layer, the felt sense in our body, and then also the layer that I don't see in a lot of personal development, which is the archetypal layer. This is the deeper layer, where we start to recognize there are certain patterns that keep reoccurring in our lives, and when this layer is understood, it may begin to answer some questions that you have, but also perhaps some questions that you didn't realize that you had. And so what I've noticed is that our inner architecture is actually made up of these three layers. And when we can have these three layers working in our alignment, where the deeper patterns in our lives, these patterns that keep showing up, that we may be ignoring, perhaps we haven't necessarily honored or acknowledged certain patterns, certain life lessons that keep showing up because we're focused on living the lives that we've been taught to live, right? That we may be ignoring some of these regular recurring patterns. Often that is tied to our deeper archetypal layer that is trying to get us to pay attention to certain things for us to experience. Now, when our emotional and somatic layer is aligned to that, as well as our mindset through our identities and the way we think, when we have greater alignment, then what we experience is a state of extreme flow, right? Where things don't feel like so much of a struggle because we're working not against who we really are, but more in sync with who we really are. So we'll talk about that in the next episode, where I go into depth of the three layers of inner architecture and how we can actually find greater alignment with those. And then we'll go into the second component in episode number 3, which is where I talk about synchronicity-based navigation. And this is something that's really exciting to me, and it's shown up throughout my life as well. So it was a reoccurring pattern, as I just mentioned before, something that I didn't always pay attention to fully, but when I did, things opened up. So I'll go into that and I'll address some sort of common misconceptions about synchronicity, but more so, I just wanted to help us understand there is a deeper phenomena playing out when it comes to synchronicities that I believe was meant to be featuring more heavily in our lives. And when we do that, and certainly when we have our inner architecture more aligned, we'll notice that synchronicities begin to flow a lot more, and we'll experience a lot more synchronicities in our life. But synchronicity-based navigation that I'll go through in episode 3 is really about a different way of orienting and finding direction in our lives, and decision making and timing. And I think this is a deeper level of intelligence that we're certainly not taught about in school. I was never taught about in school, but it was showing up throughout my life at various different points. And certainly I found that when I was working in greater alignment with my true inner architecture, these synchronicities showed up more and more often. And I'll talk about that as not some kind of mystical woo-woo manifestation tool, although it can support manifestation, but it's far more about what's really going on within the synchronicities that I believe needs to be understood. Because as the world becomes more complex, as life starts to feel more and more involved and more challenging, I believe that having a more intuitive way of being guided through life, of finding our direction in life, is going to be more and more important, right? Because if you're anything like me, sometimes the amount of information out there, the number of options out there can feel rather overwhelming. And certainly it becomes that whole performance-based culture that I described earlier on. When the number of options and when the level of complexity increases, there's only so well that we can perform, because as human beings, our capabilities, while I do believe that we are unlimited beings, I believe that our limitless nature is one that is far more apparent when we're tapped into our deeper capacities, our more spiritual capacities, than when we're only relying on our physical capabilities. Now, I hope that makes sense. But it's when there are limits to our physical capabilities. And even though we can push those, and we've seen great examples of people throughout history that have pushed their physical capabilities, there is only so much that we can achieve through our physical bodies. But when we connect to that deeper part of ourselves, I believe we are truly limitless beings. And this is a set of capacities that I believe are enabled through our mind and through that deeper part of ourselves, our spirits, that greater force that I believe is connecting and binding all things. So those are some of the different things that I believe will be enabled through understanding the synchronicity-based navigation that I'll talk about in episode 3. We'll begin to tap into some of those greater powers that we have. And then the third component in the OS is aligned expression. So as we navigate ourselves throughout our lives, expression is how we engage with the world. We express ourselves, right? So the various things that we do in our lives, whether it be in our work or our businesses or in our personal relationships, our intimate relationships, or through our health and well-being, by nurturing our bodies, by experiencing the various different things we want to experience in life, whether it be travel or leisure, having fun, creating different things that we want to create. All these various different domains of our lives are ones that all involve our expression, right? How we express ourselves. But as I've mentioned sort of earlier on, if we're working in alignment, if we're working out of alignment, then our expression isn't aligned expression. It can be an expression that can often feel forced. It can often feel like we're just performing. But when our inner architecture is working in greater alignment, and when we are working with synchronicity-based navigation, when those two are working together much better, what is a natural emergence is aligned expression. It's a capability, something that we're all capable of. And when our expression in life is far more aligned with who we really are and with the true nature of reality, then we don't have to force all the outcomes that we're taught to force. We don't have to try so hard to hit performance targets. They naturally fall into place. So aligned expression is what occurs when our inner architecture is aligned and working harmoniously with our synchronicity-based navigation to move those two things forward, and that natural occurrence is aligned expression. So that sort of flow state that you find a lot of people are chasing is not one that you have to focus on controlling so much. It's one that you actually naturally tap into, because I've come to understand that our expansion is innate. The nature of who we are is one that's naturally expanding and growing as we go through life. That is something that we don't need to force. We don't need to force our expansion, our growth in life. It's something that we actually need to liberate, right? It's something that we don't need to force. It's one that is often one where we're trying to control that, and therefore we're trying to control it with how we're being taught. And that can sometimes interfere with our natural expansion. And I'll talk about that again when I get to synchronicity-based navigation, and perhaps also in episode 4 with aligned expression. But what you'll find is that we come into this life, and we are designed to expand and grow naturally. And when we can get out of our own way a lot of the times, then we'll notice that our expansion, our growth, will continue without having to do all those things that we've been taught we have to do in order to achieve the kind of life and the results that we really want to experience in life. So they're the 3 components of the OS. Inner architecture, understanding that inner architecture that is innate but often out of alignment. So understanding our inner architecture and how we can get that to be aligned with those 3 layers of our psychology, our emotional and somatic layer, as well as the archetypal layer. And then the second component is our synchronicity-based navigation, how we are finding direction and how we are orienting in our life and making decisions that are far more meaningful and timing a lot better. And then the third component, when the first 2 are working together, which is our aligned expression. They're the 3 components of the InSync OS. So how did this all happen for me was, how would I discover that? When I kind of look back throughout my life, there were various different signs and various different things occurring, and the more I didn't pay attention, it was kind of like the messages started to get louder, or the pain got more intense, right? So it was like there was some part of me that had to be seen, and I didn't realize it when it first occurred. But I can honestly trace back and see that there were these synchronistic events that were occurring throughout my life, but certainly as I was starting to move from university into working life. And I can tell those stories throughout some other episodes, but that was when I really first started to notice that things were happening beyond my control, that I wasn't even trying to manifest consciously. And it was like there was something guiding me to a direction that I couldn't see, but it was taking care of me. It had my best interests at heart. And that occurred right around the time when I was going through a major life transition. And I'll talk about this more in synchronicity-based navigation, because whenever we're going through changes, and certainly major changes in our lives, we tend to notice that synchronicities will show up. And that's been recorded and documented through a lot of research through folks like Carl Jung, whose work we'll tap into a little later on in some of the other episodes. But I certainly noticed that. Now, it wasn't until I was probably a couple of years into my graduate position as an IT consultant at a global consulting firm, whereby I started to notice that I was asking questions around, well, is this all there is, right? I'd worked for a couple of years and I was starting to become more successful, and I was able to make a good amount of money and accelerate my income. But I started to feel like it wasn't all that was cracked up to be. This sort of working life that many of us had been taught was the way to be successful and effective in life. And I then started to find these deeper questions started to emerge as I was going through my 20s and 30s, and then discovering personal development and Tony Robbins. And I started to discover transformational work. And the more I learned about what we're taught outside of conventional school, the more I realized that the way we've been taught to be effective and successful through our conventional education routes just wasn't working. It just wasn't cutting it. It just wasn't fulfilling me. It wasn't giving me the promise. Sure, it was allowing me to make money and live a very comfortable living, and I explored and traveled the world and had amazing experiences and a hell of a lot of fun. But it did reach a point when I got to sort of around the mid-30s where I just realized I can't see myself living this way. So I started to explore different things and different ways of understanding life and growth and all of those things. But I stayed in that sort of corporate world, in that mode of living the way I was taught to be successful for so long, because that's all I knew around how I needed to be successful was, stay in the job and make lots of money and or make as much money as you can and stay safe, and don't follow some of your passions and interests if they don't align with the life that you were taught to live. That was that 9-to-5 model, and 4 weeks off a year, get yourself a mortgage and all that kind of stuff. I was just finding that it just felt like it wasn't fulfilling me at a deep level. I felt like I was capable of so much more, but I couldn't quite understand how to achieve that. And now, as I look back on it, I realize my inner architecture was off. My nervous system was sensing things at that more innate level. It knew that something wasn't right. Something else needed to be seen. A deeper part of me needed to be expressed. And it was then that I started moving in this direction and planting a lot of the seeds and doing a lot of the work that has led to In Sync and what you're experiencing and listening here to today. So the more I listened to that, I went through a lot of challenges and a lot of struggles. And a lot of it had to involve allowing a part of myself to fall away and to die, an old identity to die, in order for this new identity, my true identity. In fact, it wasn't so much that it was a new identity, because it's who I've always been and who I really am, but it felt new in that it was something that I hadn't really allowed to be fully expressed and fully seen by the world. And therefore operating in a way that was far more aligned to who I really am and who I'm really here to become felt new, even though at the same time it felt true, it felt honest, it felt real. And you're experiencing and listening to this right now, today, in this session. In Sync represents who I really am, and I believe it's who we all really are, when we can understand this and give it a chance. So that's a little bit about my story in a nutshell. There's more to it than that, of course. There is a number of different details throughout the journey, but I certainly noticed that throughout that whole journey that now spans over 50 years, when I honored that and when I listened to the synchronicities, when I worked on my inner architecture, and it wasn't so much that it needs fixing. We don't need fixing, as I mentioned before. We're born whole, but it's more about removing the different things that have been programmed and put in place that don't allow our natural innate selves to emerge. And it's more about removing that interference or those blocks, but to allow the alignment to occur so that we can become and live more in sync. So what I noticed when I stopped forcing and started allowing, it was challenging at first. It certainly is. But I just noticed that things began to flow more and that my life became more and more meaningful when I honored those messages and those signs that were emerging. It started to really fall into place. So I guess my invitation to you is to give yourself permission to ask yourself some deeper questions around, are you really living in sync with who you really are? Are you really living true to who you know deep down that you're really truly here to become? So the invitation that I'm offering is to ask if that may be true for you, and therefore, if you are completely honest, have you also been operating from an outdated model that is perhaps no longer working for you? And therefore, might it be time for you to consider some of these deeper questions and to start embracing a different model, whether it's the model that I'm offering you here through InSync, or whether it's time to discover your own. And my hope for you is that regardless of whether you agree with whatever I'm offering here, that you challenge the current model that I believe is breaking down. And if that hasn't been working for you, that you begin to challenge it and give yourself permission to find something different, to find something new and give that an opportunity to work better for you in your life. So that's my invitation for you, is to go a little deeper and allow some of those questions, give them permission to be asked and answered, and perhaps go a little deeper, perhaps watch the next few episodes, and ideally, the first 6 episodes, including this one, so the next 5 episodes, because the first 4 will talk about, so this episode 1 is the overview, right? And then episodes 2, 3, and 4 will be the 3 components that we've discussed in this overview. And then with episodes 5 and 6, I'll go a little deeper into some other ideas and concepts. So at a minimum, I'd recommend watching the first 4 episodes, including this one. But ideally, if you could watch the first 5 or 6 and get at that deeper understanding, that would be my invitation to you. So I provided all of those here. And then as we go on, I'll discuss more and more topics, and I'll put together more and more episodes to really go deeper, as what I believe to be a new operating model will begin to evolve more and more over time. There'll be more conversations that I'll like to invite you all to participate in, where you can ask questions and things like that. I'd certainly like to offer you that opportunity to submit some questions, and so that I can hear what's working for you or what's not working for you, or what are your challenges, and I'll aim to answer those in some other episodes as well. So that is what I wanted to share with you today in this first episode of InSync. So my hope is that this has resonated with you and hit a chord with you in one way or another. And I'd like to invite you to go deeper, to watch the next episode, which is all about our inner architecture. And if you think that there's someone that you know that also might benefit from this, feel free to share this with them. And the links will be all provided that you can share that with them. But send them this and give them an opportunity as well to live more and more in sync.